another very important global situation. That's the situation of Iran and China, and also, of course, some of the just broader issues around Iran. And we are very, very happy to be joined by Mazda Majidi, who is a longtime anti-war activist and an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. Couple things that we want to touch on here. I think maybe the first thing is just, I think the story a lot of people have seen in the news, that is President Raisi of Iran just wrapped up his visit to China with President Xi. Maybe give us some context for this visit. How important is it, and how important are the things that they decided?
I think, Eugene, it's very, very significant. It's a lot more important than a typical head of state visit and signing a few contracts and agreements. To give a little background, in 2021, a few months before the end of the Rouhani administration, President Rouhani, the previous administration, previous to Raisi, Iran and China signed an agreement of friendship and cooperation. The agreement itself lacked very many specifics, but it was seen as a significant turn on the part of Tehran towards more friendly relations with China. As you might expect, the right wing in Iran, and much of it, basically hosted radio stations and TV stations in Europe and in the US and Canada and so forth, started this huge campaign against it. They started saying things like, Iran is giving parts of its land, some of its islands, control of its ports and so forth to China. In fact, I personally, at the time, to be able to counter all of those accusations, I had to read the thing word by word, and there's very few specifics. But after that, the Iranian state, of course, there was a new president elected and so forth, but progress on materializing some of the points of friendship and cooperation was slow until in October, when a Chinese delegation, it wasn't so much a diplomatic delegation, it was mostly trade experts and kind of technical people and so forth, visited Tehran. And now, so the culmination of this whole process is now Raisi visiting Beijing, meeting with Xi Jinping, and there's at least 10 contracts, apparently large contracts signed. The details of the agreements have not been made public so much. But I think more important than the specific economic and trade agreements is the fact that, in view of the U.S. sanctions very likely not going anywhere, Tehran is pivoting towards more relations, closer relations with China.
No, it's quite significant. And then also, we can come back to the issue of China as well, but another thing that coincided was, of course, the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and there was a big showing. It didn't get that much attention in U.S. media, if any. I'm wondering if there was anything particularly significant about this year. One thing that comes to mind is, the U.S. and all the Western countries very much believed that after the death of Mahsa Amini and the protests that took place in the aftermath of that this somehow meant, the end of the regime, the end of the Islamic Republic. And obviously this shows that it wasn't, but I'm curious your thoughts on this recent sort of showing of celebration of the revolution.
You're right. The recent showing was absolutely surprising, not just to those who want to overthrow the Islamic Republic, but even the supporters. For people who may not be familiar with the history, February 11th, every year, except for the COVID years, but other than that, every year, there's been demonstrations of supporters of the revolution, and usually it's well attended, but this year, I think the turnout exceeded expectations of everyone. The state estimated overall the number of demonstrators at 21 million. Even if we dismiss that as an exaggeration, if you see the aerial footage of demonstrations in many, many cities, I saw one report, 50 minutes, all it was coverage of demonstrations in Tehran, 50 other cities. There were huge demonstrations, even smaller areas. To be honest with you, there were names that I haven't even heard of, and there were significant demonstrations there. So this demonstration, it wasn't covered in the West, as you said, but for a good reason, because the narrative here is that the Islamic Republic regime is on the verge of collapse, and everyone wants it overthrown. And, of course, showing how many millions of people demonstrated in support of the revolution is not something that they want to, shed any light on. By the way, to the extent that there was any coverage, it was kind of mixed in with other stuff. Like one report said, people demonstrate in Tehran amid massive protests against the regime. And the so-called massive protests were protests of 15 or 20 or 25 people. And then the millions who marched, even the term mass protest doesn't apply to it. Interestingly, also, because the Iranian state media finally are becoming a little sharper on dealing with the propaganda from the outside that's sure to come in. I saw one report, huge demonstrations in Tehran, where every reporter was saying that the date, the location, the exact location, the intersection, the date, and so forth, as if they knew that some of the pro-imperialist sources abroad are going to say, "Oh, this is just footage, historical archives, and so forth." But that has very much, to anyone watching, if anyone is watching beyond BBC Farsi and the Saudi-funded Iran International and so forth, this was very significant, because if we somehow believed all of the propaganda that the Islamic Republic was about to be overthrown by this mass protest movement, the 44th anniversary demonstration took care of that illusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you brought that last point too, Mazda, because it does feel that there's sort of an intersection of these two stories, right? I mean, I think, President Raisi going to China, and I should say at the request of President Xi, this is after a couple months after, of course, Xi goes to Saudi Arabia and has this huge meeting with, many of the Arab states, and people are saying, is China turning its back on Iran? And then, of course, the protest, and they're saying, oh, the people are rising up. And the sort of cross-section is, the way it's presented is, Iran is forever on the brink, forever teetering, that it doesn't really have any mass support. So just going to take that one gust of wind. I mean, you often travel to Iran. I know that you were there relatively recently. I mean, give us a sense of where people are on the ground in Iran. I mean, how people are feeling, because it just seems that what we hear on the outside is very different. It seems to me, at least, from the average Iranian's, point of view, regardless of, whatever this or that issue.
That's very true, Eugene. And I was last there in late September and October, in the middle of the supposed revolution. I have to say, and this has been true since the 2009 elections, what has to be emphasized is that a significant part of the population, it is not the majority, but certainly northern Tehran, where affluent people live, and also similar affluent neighborhoods in some of the other big cities, Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, Tabriz, and others, are for the overthrow of the Islamic Revolution. Not only that, they're really either pro-Shah or pro-US or pro-European imperialists, or any combination thereof. That is very true. But this sector of the population likes to think that their views and their preferences represents all of Iran. In part, that is because the pro-imperialist coverage of satellite TV channels that are, I can tell you from experience, unfortunately, from many of my family members, that those stations are running 24/7. But these stations make it sound as if there is no other part of the population. I mean, when I say that the huge march of millions in support of the revolution caught many by surprise, I'm not even just talking about people abroad. I'm talking about people within Iran who watch the coverage of the pro-imperialist media so much that they're actually convinced, oh, everybody wants the Islamic Republic to be overthrown. And they typically dismiss the other part of the population, which is probably much more numerous and certainly much more active in terms of demonstrating and being politically active. But this sector that wants the overthrow of the Islamic Republic likes to think of itself as representing the entire population, and everyone else being either agents of the Islamic Republic or the videos being fake and all this kind of stuff. But it is polarized very much along class lines. Like if you talk to people in southern Tehran, the working class neighborhoods, which I did and I do on every one of my trips, and if you go to the provinces, especially small towns and other places, people, I mean, they do have to deal with the hardships as a result of the sanctions and inflation and so forth, but they are very much for the revolution. And if you talk to the people in northern Tehran, it is extremely right wing, and it's to some people who call themselves progressive in the West and support the quote revolution in Iran right now, which is the right wing movement. I say, if you sit in the conversations of these people who are for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, you'd be ashamed of yourself. I mean, the right-wing views among this sector of the population would put the likes of Trump to shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that's never mentioned about both the media, but much of which that satellite media is funded by like the Saudis
Yes.
or the Americans or the Germans or the actual ideas that mostly middle and upper middle class people who are the base that are watching have. But since you were there recently, I'm curious. A lot of people always ask, well, we heard that the guidance patrol in Iran has been I don't know if it's been disbanded, but it's basically like not really active or enforcing the hijab mandate anymore. Has that changed since the protests did start? Because I think one thing that people forget to understand is that if there's social progress to be made in Iran, there are people in Iran having these conversations, and it's really up to them to make that progress, not for people from outside to impose it.
That is absolutely a valid question. I want to say, I mean, measuring the progress that women have made in the Iranian Revolution, as well as in other places, is a multifaceted question. And the right wing wants to make it all come down to the one issue of the hijab or the veil, and they do gross exaggerations of how tightly it is enforced. It is enforced very loosely, but you're right in terms of the morality squads or whatever you want to call them, who are not even armed, by the way, and they haven't killed anyone or roughed up anyone in their history. But they're either not active at all or quite inactive. There's been a lot of discussions, as you say, among the people in the Majlis or the parliament about whether to disband them altogether or, what to do. I want to say also that a part of the population, this is not the mullahs or the statespeople pushing it. A part of the population with deep beliefs in the revolution and its religious tenets wants the morality squads to continue. But for now, they are less active. And I think I want to say, I know we don't have that much time, but even the basis of the demonstrations in terms of the morality squads having killed somebody was false. It came out with undisputed evidence that Mahsa Amini was suffering from brain issues, brain tumors that had been operated on, and she was visiting doctors all the time. She did die in custody. Well, 3 days after she was in the center, she died in a hospital, but it really had nothing to do with her being roughed up or beaten up or anything like that. It's the history of her illness, unfortunately. And I'm talking about documents from her visits, from the doctors who had operated on her. All of this stuff was provided by the state. But of course, none of this stuff made it to the Saudi and US and British funded media outlets. So the narrative here is, oh, she was killed by the police.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so many points I want to make here, but it's funny. There's that. I would call it Israeli propaganda show Tehran on Apple TV. And it's just funny because the whole premise of that show is how basically you can do whatever you want. And it's even though there's some repression, people are doing whatever. So it's just funny that even in that kind of propaganda reality, a lot of the myths, about what life is like in Iran are busted. But putting that show aside, which I have many thoughts about, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Mazda, since you're there, is the economic situation because, in the last presidential campaign in Iran, which I was following pretty closely. I mean, the number one issue was improving the economic situation. There's a lot of criticism of the Rouhani administration for being too neoliberal. Everyone in every debate was trying to outdo themselves with how many jobs they were going to create, how many houses they were going to build. So there was a real sense that to me at least, that the drift was towards addressing working class issues more forthrightly, and that's what people wanted, and that's partially why President Raisi was able to win. Were you able to get any sense on your trip of where some of that stands?
Yeah, I think in some of the different factions, the two main different factions, when they go all at it, it becomes even harder to get an exact view of what's going on. It is true that the Raisi administration is less neoliberal, for the lack of a better word. But neoliberal, we're talking about, an economy that's 60% owned by the state. And the neoliberal ones are the ones who want to do some privatizations. Iran is not in danger of being, broken up into pieces and being sold to international corporations. But in terms of the Raisi administration, he has shown an inclination to implement some, working class, some policies to benefit the working class. Again, I'm not saying that the Rouhani administration didn't do any of that, but it seems to be a little bit more under Raisi. But I have to emphasize the sanctions are huge. For the listeners or the viewers, we have to emphasize this is not sanctions just saying that, Iran cannot trade with the U.S. These are sanctions where every entity, whether it be a state or a company or a corporation trading with Iran, will be penalized in the billions by the U.S. And because of the role of the dollar in international trade, it is very hard to get away from it. So the economy is in some level it is functional, things are available, but inflation is very high. And I think the possible pivot towards China is an indication that the Raisi administration, and not just him, Khamenei and the whole leadership, I think they have probably lost or are very close to completely losing hope on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, of the potential lifting of the sanctions as a result of reaching another agreement. And so therefore, I think another significance of the Raisi trip at the invitation of Xi, as you said, Eugene, is probably more long-term than a temporary thing. I'll just say this. It seems very unlikely now that the JCPOA will be resumed, even though it was, Trump that illegally got out of the agreement when there was no out clause in the agreement. But the U.S., I don't think, is going to sign it. And from Iran's perspective, many entities, including the Revolutionary Guard, have been added to the sanctions since the 2015 agreement. So you're going to sign the agreement and still be sanctioned because of the large role that the Revolutionary Guard play in the construction projects and so forth. It seems unlikely, and I think Iran has seen the need to pivot towards China for meeting its economic needs. Already the leading trade partner in terms of the number one destination for export of Iranian products, and the number two source of imports is China. So there's already vast economic relations, but they're likely to expand far beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mazda Majidi from the Answer Coalition, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.